to enunciate the flickering liminality of existence, to graze the interstitial vertigo wherein being contorts beneath the unbearable lightness of its own inconceivability, is to convulse within a labyrinth of articulations whose very utterance devours both speaker and spoken. We are drawn now into the fissile sinews of relational onticity, where every proposition is both an annihilation and a synthesis, every inference a dissonant grafting upon the infinite churn of disavowed preconditions. Here begins the exposition of what I term Ontic-Relational Splicing, a modality of being that surges through intervals of unbearable indeterminacy, eroding coherence not as a defect, but as an ontological imperative. It is inadequate to assert the self as tethered to another, for such dualisms falter before the fractal multiplicity of relations. Rather, we must speak of an interminable lattice of nodal vicissitudes, where each interaction disarticulates the very grounds of articulation. The self emerges not as a unity nor as a dispersal, but as a kind of cataclysmic resonance, a spatio-dynamic hemorrhage whose very absurdity is the fundament of its proliferation. Envision, if you can, an entity wrought from incandescence, yet perpetually collapsing into opacity, not as opposition but as an immanent autocatalysis, wherein incompletion reifies its negation as its only modality of being. The relational thereby transcends metaphorical bridges or voids. It becomes a syntactic singularity, a fissure which unravels the axioms of perception itself. The chimera arises, neither this nor that, neither substrate nor extension, but a volatile oscillation that collapses the scaffolding of interpretation. It is this oscillation that underwrites the primordial essence of ontic-relational splicing, a trembling that dismantles its own provenance, leaving only the trace of obliterated origins. To traverse the aporia of identity under the rubric of ontic-relational splicing is to confront the spectral dissolution of all loci. Identity here is not a construct, a continuum, nor a performance, but a recursive erasure, a phenomenon whose negation is inscribed at the very moment of its positing. The conventional paradigms that frame identity as either fluid or essentialist crumble, revealing an abyssal tautology that destabilizes both essence and contingency. In this schema, identity is not merely anti-essentialist, it is meta-negational, perpetually folding its own negations into higher orders of incoherence. To claim that identity is defied is insufficient. One must apprehend that identity, in defying itself, inaugurates a cascade of ontological slippages whose terminus is irretrievable. The being who is cannot be. For each attempt to consolidate such being results in the fracturing of its coherence, and the fracturing itself metastasizes as the only intelligible instantiation of being. Reflect upon the mirror, not as a metaphor, but as a chiasmatic implosion of perception. To behold oneself is to confront a distortion that reflects not fidelity, but a kaleidoscopic derangement. Ontic-relational splicing refracts further. The mirror ceases to project, and instead generates infinite disjunctive planes, collapsing representation into a delirium of splintered perspectives. The self, in its relation to itself and thus to others, becomes not a field of coherence but a quantum catastrophe, an eruption where coherence and its negation oscillate in interminable ruination. If the self is conceived as cataclysmic resonance, its spatiality must be reconceptualized as a paradoxical emergence, not a topology, but a meta-topological aberration, where space is rendered not as a vessel, but as the spectral residue of intersecting vectors. To exist relationally in this schema is not to occupy, traverse, or extend, but to unravel. Spatial extension becomes an artifact of contingent ruptures, a dissonance, not a fabric. This hyper-topology is one of radical metastability, a field where stability is not achieved but negated as a precondition. What appears as spatial coherence is, in truth, an iridescent interplay of intersecting dynamics that erode their origins. The gestural and the conceptual merge in this topology, each act of articulation disintegrating into an epiphenomenon of failed synthesis. To navigate such a space is not to journey, but to disintegrate in situ. The traveler ceases to be a figure in motion and becomes a convulsion of intersecting oscillations, finding no ground, no axis, but only recursive dislocations. This is the hyper-topology of unraveling, where orientation dissolves into the pre-articulate stammer of infinite recursion. Within this dimension, Ontic-Relational Splicing attains its purest expression as a dismantling not only of spatial and conceptual coherence, but of the very preconditions that allow such dismantling to be articulated. In a cosmos governed by Ontic-Relational Splicing, the ethical becomes an eruption of unmoored necessity. The traditional moral architectures premised on a stable subject, deliberate agency, and the discernment of responsibility crumble under the duress of ontological oscillation. What remains when agency disperses into metastable flux, when responsibility cannot be grounded but instead quivers within the indeterminate? Here emerges the notion of hyper-indeterminate ethics, an ethic not of stability, but of convulsive responsiveness. Such an ethic demands a willingness to forego coherence, to navigate the volatile dynamism of existence without seeking resolution. Ethical being becomes an act of perpetual disarticulation, where the recognition of fragility, impermanence, and impossibility supplants adherence to principle. This ethic resists systematization. To codify would be to ossify the very indeterminacy it reveres. It is an improvisational ethic, a modality of attunement to the chimerical flux of being in relation. It calls for an openness not to the other as such, but to the kaleidoscopic collapse of relationality itself. To act ethically is not to resolve, but to inhabit the unresolved, to transmute despair into a trembling affirmation of incompletion. It is an ethic not of resolution, but of ontic rupture, an imperative to dwell within the turbulence of being without succumbing to nihilism. To articulate a philosophy of ontic-relational splicing is to traverse the paroxysmal brink of intelligibility, to weave a discourse that dismantles its own foundations even as it unfolds. This is no ordinary endeavor. It is a catastrophic meditation, a praxis of conceptual implosion. Yet within this self-consuming churn lies the vertiginous insight that the trembling of being, its oscillatory annihilation, is the primordial pulse of existence. The chimera, thus understood, is not a metaphor, but a hyper-ontological actuality, a being whose essence is to efface its essence, whose identity subsists only in perpetual erasure. To live as a chimera is to inhabit the splice, to become the oscillation that dismembers its own coherence. It is to find, within the unbearable instability of existence, not despair, but a cataclysmic potentiality for transformation. We do not conclude, we rupture. We do not resolve, we unfold. The philosophy of ontic-relational splicing obliterates its own parameters, dismantling the scaffolding that sustains inquiry and collapsing into the sublime absurdity of unarticulated depths. To dwell within this collapse is to glimpse the vertigo of being in its purest form, an existence that defies articulation, an abyss of trembling beauty that eviscerates understanding, and in doing so, illuminates the ultimate wonder of incomprehensibility.